Okay, we're going to begin now. I'm Jerry Garfinkel, and welcome to the Jewish Study Center. I'm the treasurer of the Jewish Study Center, and as such, I have to tell you that our classes are all free. Our instructors are wonderful, but we do have some expenses. For example, hosting the Zoom conference, the Zoom session. So if you want to give us a donation, that would be appreciated, though not required. Just go to our website, www.jewishstudycenter.org, and click on donate. You can donate via your PayPal account or via credit card or via a check. And if you want to do a check, you can, the website will tell you where to send the check. Okay, I got a little distracted because I wanted to put the captions on. Okay, so now a few technical words. I just now put on the closed captions. So if you can't, understand my accent or Danny or Howard or Amy, you can just look at the closed captions. This whole session is being recorded, as you probably realize. When the whole session is over, I'm going to edit out the part that starts before I began, because I always put the recording on early. And then I'll post the recording on YouTube, and I'll send an email to everybody who's registered for the class. And that email will say where the recording is and perhaps a little more information about Danny and his book. Now, we do want your questions and your comments, but everybody's muted. So put your questions or comments in the chat box and address it to everybody. Sometimes you put a question in, someone in the chat will answer you. Or, you put a comment in, someone will comment on your comment. So you get a little chat going on in the chat box, kind of. I guess that's what it's for. So after the presentation is over, the formal presentation, Amy Schwartz will conduct a Q&A. So whatever questions you have in the chat will likely be asked to Danny and or Howard. I think that's it. So now I will introduce Howard Mortman. Howard is a what do you call it? Okay, here we go. Howard is the communications. Howard is a communications director for C-SPAN. He's written the book "When Rabbis Bless Congress." Interesting book about all the rabbis up to the time of the book who have opened up congressional sessions. And he's also done stand-up, as you'll see as he goes by. But his most important thing he's ever done is that he is the moderator of the Jewish Study Center Alatka Humantash debate for the last 4 or 5 years. That is what he's most famous for. So, Howard, you can take it over now.
Thank you, Jerry. I'll leave the jokes for the end of March when we do the debate. But I appreciate that, and thank you to the Jewish Study Center for putting this on. I just want to reiterate one thing: if there are new people who have joined for this event tonight who have not participated in a Jewish Study Center event before, it's a wonderful program that Amy and Jerry lead. And Jerry was being very modest, but these are all volunteers doing this, and it is contributing, participating, anything you could do to get involved is great. It's just a wonderful organization. I want to get right to tonight's program. A couple things just to set up. Jerry mentioned we're going to have questions at the end. What I'm going to do is kind of talk with Danny for a little bit at the top, and then have a couple of general questions. And then we'll go to a reading that Danny's going to have from his book, and then do a PowerPoint presentation. And Danny and I will kind of kibitz during it, perhaps, and then come out of it, Danny and I will talk a little bit more about the book. And then, as Jerry said, we'll open up to questions. And then Amy is going to lead that discussion. One element to that, if anybody in the audience has a personal connection to any of the characters, a direct personal connection to any of the people involved in this story, in Jack Ruby or from Dallas, not that you're still mourning the assassination of John F. Kennedy, but more if you know anybody that will, any of the characters that we're talking about today, please indicate that in the questions if you have a question, because we'd love to hear any personal anecdotes or relationship to anybody's. But let's just get started. Danny Fingeroth, thank you for joining us. Danny Fingeroth, why did you write a book about Jack Ruby?
Funny you should ask. By the way, I applaud your choice of a background decor. That it would have been, if I did it, it would have been tacky and too much. But I think it's quite appropriate for you to have my book cover. Have Jack Ruby looking down on you up at you from wherever. Why Jack Ruby? I'm 70 years old. So I was 10 years old when the assassination happened, and it really, I was not obsessed with it. It was too much. It was, the Warren Commission. No, the Warren Commission is not true. No, there's this theory, there's that. There was the mob, it was the CIA, it was the Russians, it was Lyndon Johnson. I just, I think like a lot of people, including, say Jerry Seinfeld, who did the famous Spitter episode of Seinfeld, and the assassination of Buckwheat on the on SNL. Just, it was so big, it was too much. Then about 10 years ago, 12 years ago, I started researching for a graphic novel project. My background is largely in the graphic novel world, and I wanted to do something. I thought, well, maybe people will be interested in a nonfiction graphic biography of Jack, about the Kennedy assassination. And when I started researching, I went, oh, well, the Danny Fingeroth angle on this is Jack Ruby, this bizarre, first-generation born child of Eastern European Jewish immigrants, kind of like, my family, and maybe a lot of your families. And some of my relatives are out there, so they know what I'm talking about. I figured, I saw Jack Ruby for a time, and I mean, I still do. Assuming one is not one's own weirdest relative, then I think Jack Ruby would be your weirdest cousin, except he happened to change history by killing Lee Harvey Oswald on television. So since that period of beginning the research and then finding out about a guy named Hillel Silverman, who was Jack Ruby's rabbi, and I think there are people connected to Rabbi Silverman in the audience tonight, so no pressure on me. Just the more and more I got into it, the more and more I saw, boy, this is it's national, it's world, it's historical, it's something that we're still living with the echoes of today, but it's also personal, So that's why Jack Ruby.
So Danny, you said it's also personal. You also said at the beginning you're 70 years old now. So let me ask you, where were you when John F. Kennedy was assassinated?
I have one of the most boring stories ever. However, I recently found a way to make it mildly interesting. Because where I was living in New York City, and anybody who knows me will not be surprised to know that I had just come back from shopping for used comic books at a secondhand magazine store on First Avenue in Manhattan. And that was in the days when a used comic book was not a collectible. It was half price because it was used. Somebody read it already. So, I was just walking down the street with this friend I went with, and we ran into other friends who told us. But somebody actually, in a biographers group that I'm part of, had this question that turned out to be a very Jewish connected question, because the question was, what were you doing on the street in the middle of a school day? And of course, I was a student at a yeshiva in Manhattan that had let out early, but because I lived walking distance, it wasn't going to get dark for a couple of hours. So they let us out early for any teachers or students. So I realized, oh my God, there's even like a a Jewish angle to that reason. Because a lot of people have stories like, we were learning math and the principal busted in and said, everybody go home, the president, or we were at the office and an announcement came over the loudspeaker, so I don't have that dramatic, but the reason I don't have a dramatic story is sort of a Jewish angle on the whole thing.
All right, so everybody always asks, where were you when JFK was assassinated? Let's push it. Let's ask a question probably no one's asked. Where were you when Lee Harvey Oswald was shot?
Well, being that I was 10 years old, being that there was nothing on television for 2 straight days but the assassination, I think I was just sort of sitting and grumpy and watching. I couldn't even tell you if it was the live killing or the instant replay, but I was basically just sitting there going, when are my cartoons coming back already? And then I couldn't even tell you if at 10, I was again, a lot of people will sort of write, oh, I was 5 or I was 10, but I knew then the world was, I knew the whole weekend I knew everything was weird, and I can't say I grasped the import or the fact that I'd write a book, or that 60 years later we'd be talking about, when you're 10, the idea of 60 years is not even a concept you can wrap your brain around.
So there are so many books about President Kennedy, about assassination, about Jackie Kennedy. Every aspect of this very short presidency has been written about, and also many books. And mentioned the Seinfeld episode of the assassination and Lee Harvey Oswald, but Jack Ruby books. How what is your competition? What's in the literature field for books about Jack Ruby?
Well, about 2 years ago, a very good book by another guy named Dan, whose name I'm blanking. It was a much more famous Dan. Anyway, a book about the Ruby trial came out, and boy, oh boy, my heart sank when I saw that. Dan Abrams and a guy named Fisher. But when I read it, because of course I bought it the day it came out, I saw that it was focused on the trial in great depth, and I don't know how it sold. I mean, but it seemed to me that it was a book that was intended more for trial buffs and people who are into the minutia of trials and courtroom procedure. It was very well written, and it was a good read, but you really have to want to get into the weeds of trials, and it wasn't really a biography in that sense. So that was the most recent one. Gary Wills and Ovid Damaris wrote a book right after Ruby died, I think, in early '67. It had been a couple of articles in Esquire, and then they made that into a book, which is very good. And I think it's been occasionally, it'll go to new printings, but that was in '67. And then Seth Kanter wrote a book, maybe in the '70s or '80s, I forget. Seth Kanter was a reporter, a Dallas reporter. Those are the 3 main books about Jack Ruby, and most of them are decades old. And I did have some research and some resources that I don't think the other authors had access to.
I was
By
going to
the
ask.
way, it's Dan Abrams wrote the book. Kennedy's Revenge.
Yeah. Actually, Danny, I was going to ask you go into a little bit of the research here. What's publicly available? What are things that no one's seen before? But go into how you research the book.
Well, I don't want to shock anybody, because some of the promotional material for this event implied, not unlike Rob Reiner's podcast, but we can talk about that we had solved that I had solved the case, that where no one else in those 1,000 other books and movies and documentaries and podcasts had figured it out, that I, Danny Fingeroth, had figured it out. I have not figured it out. But it's very tempting when you write a book about the Kennedy, some of the Kennedy assassination, to think, well, I will figure it out. I'm going to put these pieces together. I'm going to find this thing. But at a certain point, I went, no, I'm not. So here's my story about this really strange, erratic, violent guy who changed history on live TV in a way that traumatized a generation or three. So what can I find out about him? Who can I speak to who knew him, knew his friends, knew his family? Bring a couple of extra dimensions, not to bring sympathy, although I guess that's inevitable. I think he was kind of a vile individual. I got to like him less as the more I read, studied. So a big thing I had was access to Rabbi Silverman's notes. If you know the movie Weekend at Bernie's, this is the father of Jonathan Silverman, who starred in that movie. But he was a prominent rabbi and the son of a prominent rabbi. And turned out I knew somebody, as I started researching, I found Silverman wrote a memoir. I own 2 copies because I lost one. And, it's not that expensive online to get your extra copy of a Hillel Silverman's memoir. And so I read up on him. And I was mentioning to somebody, I wish I could. I was mentioning to John Ruskay, just who was the former head of UJA. Some of you may know his name. Anyway, I was mentioning to him, boy, I'd love to talk to that Hillel Silverman. He said, oh, I know Hillel. So next thing I know, I'm talking to Hillel Silverman, and who just died like 6 months ago, or maybe a little more. He died less than a year ago at age 99. And I'm talking to him, and he's had all his marbles. Even that back then he was about almost 90. And he said, I'm not writing my book anymore. I'm 90 years old. I can hardly see. Would you like to see my notes that I took when I visited Jack in prison every other day for 4 months? I said, yeah, I wouldn't mind. So he sends me his notes, complete with the rusty paper clips from 60 years ago. And so that was invaluable. Thanks to a newsman named Steve North, who may be out there. Steve had interviewed and was friendly with Ruby's siblings, and so they're not around. But through him, I was able to get access to one of Ruby's nieces and nephews, who had very rarely spoken in public before. They really, it was not their proudest family member or moment, and actually, it's quite traumatizing them to be Jack Ruby's niece and nephew. So that was the angle I took, and it's a lot of material at the what had been the book depository, where the fatal shots were fired from, or some of the shots, or whatever you want to think. But that's now a archive and research center where they have thousands of written and videotaped interview. So there it's. And there's a lot of great books, and there's, of course, the Warren Commission report itself, which, love it or hate it, it's 888 pages plus 26 pages of supporting data, plus the millions of documents that have come out since. So there's no lack of data. But since I wasn't going to solve the case, my angle was, who is this guy, and how does it affect people? What can we learn about him from his friends, relatives, and enemies, and what can we learn about the times, and what kind of picture can I paint of this person who is everybody knows the famous photo, but people know very little about Ruby.
So let's start teaching people about Jack Ruby, and we're going to go to have you do a reading and then the PowerPoint. But I must say that having read the book, it seems like you had just a lot of fun with the book and writing it, researching it. And I think, is that the case, that this was just like a big kick to do a book about Jack Ruby?
Look, it's all those cliches about writing are true. It's like opening a vein. It's like, it's like running a marathon. I mean, there were parts of it that were fun. You know, a lot of it is just a struggle to try to write something that, look, my training is in writing serialized narratives in comic books. Although this is my fifth prose book. Um, so my instinct is to write a story that's got a cliffhanger at the end of every chapter, and certainly at the end of every page. And luckily, Ruby's life and the events lent themselves to that. So you don't want to sound, was it fun? Yes, it was fun, but it was definitely weird and and walking around with Jack Ruby in your head is I say read the book or listen to the audiobook. If you like this voice, imagine 14 hours in your headphones or in your car. But as far as being the author, it's weird to live with somebody like Jack Ruby in your head.
All right, do a reading. Teach us about Jack Ruby.
Okay. All right. This is after Ruby's arrested. And while all the trial preparations are going on, so a lot of it is based, part of the section is based on Silverman's notes. And Ruby is in prison and kind of not shutting up. If nobody had a tape recorder at the Dallas Police Department when Oswald was interrogated for those 2 days, just the opposite with Jack Ruby. He wouldn't shut up. You could not, this guy would talk to anybody and everybody for 3 years. So this is from the chapter called Search for Justice. Despite the fact that he had been known for pretty much his entire residency in Dallas as Jack Ruby, the indictment for the murder of Oswald was against Jacob Rubenstein. And to hear the recording of Chief Curry reading the indictment to reporters, practically sneering the name, it's hard to not think that the intent was to make sure the entire world knew it was a Jew who'd killed Oswald. And this is not necessarily to implicate Curry as an anti-Semite, but to indicate that in 1963, even with Jews relatively prominent in the city, bigotry was so ingrained in Dallas's culture as to not be given a second thought. Interestingly, in a meeting with Hillel Silverman on January 13th, 1964, Henry Wade made a point, that was the prosecutor Henry Wade, Roe v. Wade, made a point of telling the rabbi, I want you to know that I did not intend to be anti-Semitic when I used the name Rubenstein and not Ruby. Silverman, who frequently visited Ruby in prison, often several times a week, starting a day or two after Ruby's crime, wasn't sure if he was asked to do so by Jack or his family or just decided on his own to visit his imprisoned congregant. On one of the visits, early in Ruby's incarceration, Silverman had this to say. Ruby told me that he had read from the book of Daniel. His jailer, Stevenson, a member of the Foursquare Gospel Church, is a fundamentalist Baptist. He has been telling Jack stories from the Bible and explaining them to him. Jack had read the entire book of Daniel. He told me that Daniel also had many problems and faced them with great courage. This book will give me courage too. It's generally been assumed that Stevenson was at the most benign, trying to encourage Ruby to convert to Christianity, and at worst, trying to lull him into admitting some kind of premeditation, possibly both. On the rabbi's next visit, somewhere within a few days of the previous one, about a week after Oswald's murder, Silverman observed Ruby had begun to read from the book of Judges. I liked the story of Gideon and the trumpets, Samson and Deborah, Ruby said. The story of Gideon is about a small band of soldiers tricking a much larger, more powerful enemy, using loud trumpets to make their own forces seem larger and more formidable, leading to victory. The biblical Samson was defeated by Delilah, then regained his strength and triumphed. And Deborah was a warrior prophet who led the children of Israel to triumph in battle, which ushered in 40 years of peace. All three stories are about adversity overcome and happiness achieved. Right after his entry about Gideon, Samson, and Deborah, Silverman reported that Jack Ruby said to me, The other night I saw God and a picture of my mother. Ruby certainly seemed to be living on multiple planes, and this changing relationship with reality would only become increasingly pronounced. Arguably, his crime and arrest accelerated what was probably brewing in him for a while. In his mind, he was the central figure in a drama, like Daniel in the Lion's Den, in a world where he believed that the fates of entire peoples were determined by his actions, where he was simultaneously guilty of multiple crimes and innocent as a lamb. While Silverman doesn't state, as perhaps Ruby did not, whether Ruby saw God in a picture of my mother in a dream or in a hallucination, it certainly seems as if much of Jack's mental energy was being spent on things that only he could see and understand. So shall we smoothly shift technically to
We shall. And while you're making the smooth transition, one of the things that I got a chuckle out of from reading the book, they reminded me now of when they changed their name from Rubenstein to Ruby, so they wouldn't be too Jewish. But that really isn't that much of a change. It's not like changing your name to O'Shaughnessy or something. So it's still pretty identifiable as Jewish. So
are we seeing the PowerPoint?
We are good. Take it away,
boy,
Danny.
look at that. This is like technical wizardry. Okay, well, that's the cover of the book, in case it wasn't clear enough on Howard's background. So this is to go through a bunch of highlights and lowlights of Ruby's life and background. This is the Maxwell Street neighborhood of Chicago, where Ruby was born in 1911, and it was kind of like the Lower East Side of equivalent of Chicago. And this is sort of a typical, market day there. Those are these streets. So he grew up crushingly impoverished. You may know this neighborhood more from the Blues Brothers movie, where John Lee Hooker plays in what had become a black neighborhood. And John Lee Hooker is playing a song. I believe he's playing Boom Boom. If I'm sure somebody will correct me if I got that wrong.
Right. You got it right.
Thank you. And then that neighborhood, I think, was torn down maybe by the University of Chicago. I forget exactly, but it's something else now. But that was just before it was torn down. Let's see. Also from the same neighborhood and the same generation as Jack Ruby, Benny Goodman, the famous band leader, Barney Ross, who was the welterweight champion. He was Ruby's best friend growing up, and through the years, and actually testified as a character witness, if you can believe there was such a thing, at Ruby's trial. He was born Beryl Rozovsky, and this was from back when boxing was a Jewish sport. Supreme Court Justice Arthur Goldberg was from Maxwell Street. Oh, there's a terrific book about Maxwell Street by Ira Berkow that came out in the 70s, but you can find copies, which is a terrific book. And he writes, it's not a book about Ruby, but what he writes about Ruby and his family is very insightful. There was a dark side to Maxwell Street, as you would imagine. This is a guy named Jake Guzik, who was a famous mobster. His nickname was Greasy Thumb. Not quite sure what that referred to, but I don't think it was a compliment. Let's see, what do we have here? Al Capone was the mob boss of Chicago, and supposedly Ruby and Barney Ross, as kids, ran errands for him through delivering packages which they did not know what was in them, and they were, allegedly better off. Here's Ruby having a normal life on what looks like a date with a normal person. I don't know who that woman is, although I'm imagining the initial V might be somewhere in her name, but this is Ruby just looking like a guy on leave from the Army, where he had been drafted during World War II. Here's Ruby with a canoe. And here's Ruby. One of these women is one of his sisters at some unknown resort or maybe university. But so, I mean, the guy was a guy with a life. Here he is with his sister Eva, who was the closest thing he ever had to a wife. They had this incredibly torturous, tempestuous relationship, but always kept coming back together. She was probably the person closest to him in the world. This is Ruby. Maybe a year or two before the assassination, there's a parade in downtown Dallas, and Ruby's just in the crowd watching the parade. So maybe this sort of echoes the Kennedy motorcade. And performing at that was a woman named Jewel Brown, who was a singer you may have heard of. She performed Ruby's clubs. Ruby owned not just the strip club, the Carousel, but the Carousel had comedians and singers, and he and his sister also ran country western clubs. So Jewel Brown, who was better known for working with Louis Armstrong, was someone who had, like everybody, a love-hate relationship with Jack Ruby. But a lot of, he was in the entertainment business. He himself, as you'll see, wanted to be an entertainer. He had what some people described as a very disturbingly close relationship with these dachshunds. Maybe he was. They made a wreck of the inside of his car in all the ways you can imagine that unleashed dogs would. But he referred to them as his children. There was a story he gave one of a puppy to Rabbi Silverman's family once, and when the Silvermans went on vacation, they gave the dog back to Ruby to watch for them, and when they got the dog back, the dog was a nervous wreck. The implication was that some horrible thing had happened while the dogs were in Ruby's care. This is a woman named Alice Nichols, who was in almost a Nathan Detroit kind of relationship. She was engaged, or at least dating, quote unquote, Jack Ruby for a decade. And although they hadn't spoken in several years, when Kennedy was shot, she was among the first people he called. He was so shaken up. He may also have called a bunch of different mob guys. We can talk about that. But she was sort of maybe the first personal call he made. He was so upset about the assassination. He had gone with her to a Reform temple with a Rabbi Gerald Klein to contemplate having her convert to Judaism, but she had no interest in that. And yet Ruby claimed he could only marry her if she became Jewish. Jack Ruby's sexuality is a topic of much debate. Straight, gay, bi, none of the above. I've not found any record of any woman who ever admitted to having slept with Jack Ruby, even though he's reputed to have had a long list of conquests. So, of course, I'm not sure if you would admit to having slept with Jack Ruby, but that's an interesting thing. This is the part of the context of Jewish Dallas. They were in kind of the usual, or many of the usual trades that Jews found themselves in those days. And so Honest Joe's, I've never heard that he wasn't honest, but Joe Goldstein wanted you to know, apparently.
Danny, that was a part of your fact checking to find out if Joe indeed was honest, was it, or is it you let that slide?
You know what? I bet there's somebody out there who knows.
Okay.
And then, oddly enough, the nightclub business, and specifically the burlesque and strip club business, was very Jewish. Ruby's competitors were the Weinstein brothers, who he promised he would never go into business competing with them, and then he did. There may be a Weinstein or two in the audience. This was Abe's Colony Club, which was, I believe, either around the corner or next door, because Abe and Barney had two clubs. Although they were independently owned. They were not partners as such, although they were brothers. This is Abe's Colony Club. Abe and pretty much everybody who was there, including Gabe Kaplan, who we'll get into in a minute, pretty much testified that Ruby's club, the Carousel Club, was kind of a dive, and that Abe's Colony Club was the much more high-class venue in the neighborhood. and that is Abe Weinstein, who was lived until I think into the 2000s. He and his brother were Ruby's main competitors. As you can see, I mean, he there were strippers at his club, but clearly he had a wide variety. The only one I recognize is Zazu Pitts up in the upper right there. I'm sure they're, but it looks like a star-studded group of performers he would have there. This was another part of Jewish Dallas. This was Stanley Marcus of the Neiman Marcus department store empire, and he was one of the leading liberal voices in Dallas. Dallas was very polarized, conservative and liberal, and large John Birch influence there. And Marcus had swastikas painted on both his store and his home. That is Rabbi Hillel Silverman. I took a picture of that picture when I was visiting Dallas. I apologize for the blurriness, but that is the guy. That's how he looked in his heyday when he was visiting Ruby in prison. This is a dermatologist named Coleman Jacobson, also part of Ruby's synagogue and community. He treated Ruby for various STDs and also traded gossip about the synagogue and the community with Ruby. This is one of these stranger what ifs in Jack Ruby's life. As I said, Ruby was in show business. Ruby himself would say to people, "I'm colorful, ain't I? I'm a character, ain't I?" He's here with a kid who went by the professional name of Little Daddy Nelson. And the kid was a song and dance phenomenon, and Ruby was going to be his manager and his ticket out of the small time and into the big money, and he was going to help realize Jack Ruby's show business dreams. But just as they were getting started, a woman claiming a different woman than Ruby knew as Little Daddy's mother showed up, and there was some kind of custody battle, and Ruby just kind of dropped out. But that was this was the closest I think he had to success managing entertainers. This is the Hervé Theater, which in Ruby's day was a movie theater that he and his sister managed. Now it's kind of a hipster nightclub and a venue you can rent down the block from it. And it's really a very uninteresting block, as only Dallas can have uninteresting architecture, is what had been the Country Western Club, a Country Western Club that Ruby and his sister managed. Ruby did manage what had been Bob Will's ranch house, and is today just recently reopened after a fallow period, the Longhorn Ballroom, one of the top country western venues, and they even have a little shrine to when Jack ran what's called the Bob Wills. Ruby was one of the first people to bring black entertainers to what had been an all-white country venue. So I mean, he sort of had this weird nobility, I wouldn't call it nobility, but idealism, and sort of wanted to kind of give people breaks. I wouldn't say he was free of prejudice. Certainly, I've heard quotes of him saying some unpleasant things, but I think he identified both with Catholics and with black people because of his own minority status as a Jew.
Danny, can I ask about that shrine? Is that your picture, or is that like
That's a picture. No, that's not. I did not take the picture, but
have you been to that?
I've been to the outside. The inside was closed when I was there. Have you been there?
No, I was curious. Like, does it mention Jack Ruby, the guy who shot Oswald? I was curious.
That's interesting. I think I have a feel, maybe in the small type.
Yeah,
I have a feeling.
The asterisk part, right?
They figure people must know. That's a very good question.
Okay.
This is Dub Dickerson's the guy who was a well-known country western star. He was famous for getting in a brawl with Ruby, where I think Ruby might have, I might be mixing this up with a boy named Sue, but I think, Ruby didn't bite off his ear. Ruby kneed him in the groin several times. And so Dickerson basically bit off the top joint of one of Ruby's fingers, which, it was his shooting hand. This is Ruby with Tennessee Ernie Ford, who played apparently at I think the Silver Spur. So Ruby was in the country western business, the last person, Jack Ruby, the last person to give Hank Williams Sr. Regular work, because towards the end of his life, Williams was kind of out of control and erratic and undependable. But and he had this kind of love-hate with Ruby. And there's the guy who played him in the movie, who also played Doctor Strange, Benedict Cumberbatch, right? Yes, who played him in a biopic of Hank Williams. But Ruby supposedly, at least once, when Hank Williams blacked out backstage, Ruby obviously was angry about that, but he made up for it by charging fans to come backstage and take pictures of the blacked out Hank Williams. Also, people who played at a club Ruby managed, called the Skyline or the Skyliner. These are Ronnie Hawkins and the Hawks. You may know them better as the band, identified with Bob Dylan as well as themselves. When they played for Ruby at the Skyline Lounge, apparently the place had just had a fire, and Ruby suggested that they sleep there with their instruments so nobody takes them. And there's some crazy stories in Robbie Robertson's memoir, and I think Levon Helm also reports stories about playing at Ruby's club just a few months before the assassination, and I recount those in my book. Bob Dylan did not know Ruby personally, but seems to have a little bit of an obsession. This is Ruby with James Baldwin about a month after the assassination, where he made a speech to the American Civil Liberties Union, which was giving 22-year-old Bob Dylan an award, during which he mentioned that he could identify with Lee Harvey Oswald. That didn't go over that well at the dinner. But cut to 60 years later, Dylan puts out a book last year called The Philosophy of Modern Song, which is Dylan's commentary on modern songs, although not most of which you've never heard of and I've never heard of. But this one is called Ruby, Are You Mad? Came out in '56, having nothing to do with Jack Ruby, but look at the photo they chose to illustrate it with. And then, of course, Dylan in 2020 came out with that 17-minute song Murder Most Foul about the assassination, which I'm not going to recap the song, but he does mention what is the truth and where did it go? Ask Oswald and Ruby, they ought to know. This is Jack with a couple of his dancers outside the club, just looking like anybody at work, with some of his employees. This is a comedian named Wally Weston, who was pretty well known on the comedy circuit in general. This is days before comedy clubs. And then this is you may recognize Gabe Kaplan from Welcome Back, Kotter, who at the very beginning of his career auditioned for Ruby. He and a car full of strippers had heard they were in Buffalo and heard there was work in Dallas, so they drive for like 2 days straight to get to Dallas. And he had this disastrous audition for Ruby, which we can. I know we want to. Kaplan recounted it on Gilbert Gottfried's podcast, and I recounted in the book. And then, cut to 60 years later, I'm speaking in Dallas in November, and Gabe Kaplan shows up, still, very interested in Jack Ruby 60 years later, as you would imagine if you were 19 and the guy you had a crazy encounter with 3 months later killed Oswald. How are we doing time-wise? Should I speed through? What do you think, Howard?
Let me see. I know there are a couple. Maybe speeds up a little bit.
Okay, sure. I will do that.
Okay.
Here's Ruby, who often acted as his own MC and his own bouncer, because he saw himself as a character and as a funny guy, and he loved the attention. He loved attention, but he would sometimes, acting as his own bouncer, would find himself like throwing somebody down the stairs and smashing their head against the pavement, and then suddenly going, well, "What am I doing? How did we get here? What's going on? Here, I'll buy you a pizza. Don't take me to court." And that often worked. Just another day at the office. On the second, there's Ruby, of course, on the left, and some of his entertainers. That is Tammy True, Tammy True was one of the big name dancers, and that you can see this is from her performing at the Skyliner. She would go on to kind of make the most of having been. I think she actually was Ruby's friend as well as working for him. I'm sure they stopped talking 100 times. She died a few years ago in her 80s. Until the very end, she was performing with a review called The Conspiracy Club, featuring the Ruby Review featuring The Conspiracy Club. This is Candy Barr, not her real name, believe it or not, who again was friends with Ruby but would not dance at his clubs because she thought he was too low class. Ruby gave her. She had a pot arrest. She was took the rap for like a prominent Dallas citizen, and at one point Ruby brought her a couple of dachshunds so she could start a dog breeding business. So it was he was capable of sweet gestures like that. But apparently, according to Candy Barr, the dogs just didn't like each other that way. This is Candy Barr with her one-time boyfriend Mickey Cohen, the West Coast mobster. They seem to even after they broke up, and even after she testified against him in court, they seem to maintain a friendly relationship. That's Santo Traficante, a mobster who was based in Cuba that Ruby went to visit, probably to bring money and or information and or who knows what. But he was in Jack Ruby's orbit. This is Campese's Egyptian restaurant, where I ate just a couple of months ago, and I'm in Dallas. This is where Ruby had dinner the night before the assassination. Was he plotting something, or was he just going to enjoy the fine fare there? And it is very good. It's called the Egyptian, even though it's an Italian restaurant, supposedly because they couldn't afford to change the sign. I think at a certain point, since it's now a mini chain in Dallas, and it's now pretty much a mob theme restaurant. So they have a Jack Ruby section. They have quotes from Corky Campese, one of the family, about why Ruby killed Oswald. According to Corky, it really bothered him that Mrs. Kennedy was widowed. That's it. He thought he should do something about it. They have quotes from some of the books that implicate themselves as being mob connected. And one of my favorite things is this autographed photo from Al Pacino to Joe Campese, from one Godfather to another. Ciao, Al Pacino. So but it is decorated the same way it was the day that Kennedy was shot. And there, of course, is one of the famous photos of the Kennedys in downtown Dallas. A frame from the Zapruder film. Although Zapruder's granddaughter has written a very good book called, I think, 26 Seconds, about how this 8 seconds of footage or whatever has affected their family to this day. There is Arlen Specter demonstrating his single bullet theory, which people like to mock, but actually is not all that crazy. I think.
Danny, I'm going to pause there for political junkies. Arlen Specter, of course, Pennsylvania senator, was a Republican and then a Democrat. But what is he in this picture? What is his position? Why is he in this picture?
Well, he came up with, with what's called the single bullet theory. Some people call it the magic bullet theory, of how the shot that, not the shot that killed Kennedy, but one of the shots that went through Kennedy's shoulder and also wounded Governor Connolly, who was sitting in the front seat. And this is Specter sort of doing like a demonstration of how he thought it would have worked. A lot of people.
Worked for the Warren. Part of the end, he worked for the Warren Commission.
And right? He was on the Warren Commission. He was the only, I believe, he was the only Jewish member of the Warren Commission. So that at one point, when Ruby was testifying for the Warren Commission, he would only testify if there was another Jew in the room. And even though Specter was not in the room, they ran and got him. According to Specter and to Gerald Ford, who was also on the commission, Ruby took charge of the room during his testimony, which seems very strange. And yet, Ruby was that's the book is called Many Faces, because he did have many faces. He could be crazy. He could be cowering in a corner. He could be hearing voices, and then he could also walk up and shoot a guy who should have been the most heavily guarded person in the world. This is the difference between folks, between a Pulitzer and not a Pulitzer. A second before, where nobody seemed to see him coming. Look at this. Nobody is looking at Jack Ruby. A second later, so that's how fast it happened. That's the Pulitzer for that one.
He's very well dressed, by the way. He looks great. Jack Ruby looks great in that picture. I mean, he takes a good murder picture, doesn't he? He looks
he looks weirdly like, I mean, he's very graceful. He trained as a boxer. So even though he's heavy, he's very graceful. And there's a weird way he reminded me of Jackie Gleason on The Honeymooners or something. That's a seductive thing about Ruby, because if you forget what he did and just go, oh, what a zany character, here he is after he was arrested. This is a drawing of him with Rabbi Silverman visiting on one of his trips to see Ruby, but Ruby was kept separated from the general population. But really, if somebody had wanted to take a shot at him, it would have been pretty easy. I'll speed through these. This is the defense team. The prosecuting team. Henry Wade, we talked about. Lavelle was the guy who was handcuffed to Oswald. McMillan, I think, was McMillan's testimony was key. And let's see, this is for the defense. The famous Melvin Belli was probably the most famous lawyer in America at the time, and the Ruby family went through lawyers like hot and cold running water. So they one lawyer after another, and Belli. Again, I think he was less misguided than other people think in the esoteric defense, insanity defense. But look at some of the heavy hitters. There's Hillel Silverman. There's Manfred Guttmacher from the Guttmacher Institute. There's Frederick Gibbs, who was one of the people. I don't know if he invented it, but one of the people behind the lie detector, the electroencephalogram. Barney Ross there. And here's Ruby, right? A guy who you would think would be heavily guarded. This is an impromptu news conference during a recess in the trial. And this happened multiple times a day. People coming to look, the many faces. Oh, that's a scary guy. You can see why Ruby had the rep as being terrifying. There he is, wistful, thoughtful. Any one of those people could have popped him at any moment if somebody wanted to. There's Barney Ross, a nice, lifelong friend. This might have been the Ruby trial was it was the biggest show trial since until the Chicago 7 or Chicago 8 trial. So this was a jailbreak that took place during the Ruby trial, where a bunch of prisoners, several floors above the courtroom, decided that if they tried to make an escape, nobody would shoot them because there were all these cameras and reporters around. So yes, they carved a gun out of soap and shoe polish, and they got away. But the problem was they didn't have a plan after that. So they just kind of all were pretty much recaptured within hours. And this was the New York Daily News headline. Oh, Dallas, jailbreak panics Ruby trial is captured in pictures. You really could not make this stuff up. This is Ruby after he, with all the fancy lawyers and all the various circus-like things going on, the jury convicted him in a little over 2 hours, and he looks the way anybody would look if they were sentenced to death. One of Ruby's brothers and sisters reacting. Ultimately, the verdict was overturned through a team of lawyers spearheaded by William Kunstler, who went on to become William Kunstler, and here he is. The Warren Commission report, love it, hate it. It's a ton of stuff. Let's say 888 pages, 26 volumes. This is a picture. This is just a vanity picture on my part, but it is. On the left is the president of France, D'Estaing, in the 70s. But there is Gerald Ford, who, of course, you may recall, was president for a while, but was on the Warren Commission. And there is Mickey Mantle. the New York Yankees superstar who lived next door to Jack Ruby's shul, and was friends with Rabbi Silverman. So this is a picture I couldn't convince my editor to let me put in the book, but damn it, it's my slideshow, so I'm putting it in. So here those guys are. From the minute, really, from the second Kennedy was shot, there was talk of conspiracy. Certainly, once the Warren Commission report came out, there were all sorts of people contesting it. Mark Lane was the first and one of the most famous. He wrote a book called Rush to Judgment. On the other side of the fence were people like Gerald Posner, who concluded the Warren Commission was right. Oliver Stone did not agree with that. He made a movie about it with Kevin Costner, sort of on a less judgy thing. Ruby has shown up in media. This is in the second season of the Umbrella Academy. I thought they got a lot of the Jack Ruby right in that. There was a streaming, I think Netflix. The guy that got to play Ruby, including Dachshunds. This is Steve North, who may be out in the audience. Hi, Steve. This is 1989. Steve was a producer for the Geraldo show and did a lot of important journalistic work. But he was friends with that's Ruby's sister Eva, and I think Sam, and I think Earl. I think is in the right. That was Jack's kid brother. That's Tammy True. Recently when she was performing with the conspiracy burlesque show. At one point, and this is Steve North's personal cartridge, at one point the Ruby family, to raise money for Ruby's defense, had somebody shoot 5,000 bullets from the most famous gun in the world so they could sell them as collectibles. And there is Ruby's tombstone in a cemetery outside Chicago. And the birth date has nothing in common with any of the birth dates Jack ever gave during his life, of course, because it's Jack Ruby. And that's the cover. That's my website. And why don't I stop the sharing and we can.
Sure.
I hope it wasn't too painful.
Thank you. And that was great. And in a couple minutes, we'll take a couple. I know, thanks to Amy, there are a couple questions in the chat, but I do have a couple questions coming out of that. I do want to give the audience, out of respect for the audience, let's do a more robust talk of conspiracy. And I here's my well, and actually, and to be honest, it's actually refreshing to talk about this conspiracy after a week of talking about Taylor Swift and the Kansas City Chiefs. So this is like the original conspiracy. So here's my entry point for getting into the conspiracy segment here. Reading your book, I was shocked, surprised, amazed how much research the Warren Commission did into Jack Ruby. I didn't realize that they were really exhaustive, and your book leans heavily on their work. And it just struck me that if they're going to research Jack Ruby that much, who, I mean, it's obvious why they would talk about him and interview people about him, but I've never been a conspiracist about this, but that got me thinking, well, maybe they thought there was some kind of connection. Otherwise, why spend so much time with? So I'm just going to let you go, Danny. Be full. Give us the best conspiracy theories. Work it all together for us. So take it away.
Oh my God! Well, I don't know if there's a best one. Let me avoid your question, but still try to answer it. I've been in touch lately with a guy named Bert Griffin. He's in his late 80s now, and actually, he just put out a book about Ruby and Oswald. So you asked me if there's other books, Bert, and he, has maintained for 60 years that they were right, that maybe they got some details wrong, or were kind of allowed themselves to be sidetracked. But he still believes in the two lone nuts theory. And he was the one who tasked with doing the most research about Jack Ruby. So look, there's a half dozen quote unquote conspiracy theories that are logical, that are not crazy, that are plausible, and yet, every one of them. The problem with everything relating to the Kennedy assassination is that sooner or later, the phrase, it only makes sense that, it's only logical that, it stands to reason, one can only assume. And in those gaps are where conspiracies grow and yet can't be disproved either. So, guess what? The classic thing with murder is means, motive, opportunity. Oh, yes, a lot of people did not like John F. Kennedy. But maybe they just should have voted again. You know what I mean? The idea that, and a lot of people like to be big shots and brag, I mean, especially mobsters love to, wouldn't that make you a more fearsome mobster to have your colleagues think that you killed John F. Kennedy, that you were so there's all this wiggle room and all this room where this stuff grows. And so that's, I call myself agnostic on the assassination. A lot of the Warren Commission, if you read into it, makes a lot of sense, but a lot of the other, there's some other theories that do too, but they can't all be right. Look, I thought Rob Reiner, if anybody listened to that 10-part podcast that he and Soledad, Rob Reiner promises on episode 1, I'm going to reveal who killed JFK. And he says it every episode. We're going to reveal. And then they get to the last episode. It's like, we kind of think these guys probably did it, but we're not sure. It's like, well, don't overpromise. Like, and I mean, Rob Reiner is not by any means crazy. He's very credible, very smart, very thorough. But even he, I think, I mean, maybe other people listened to it and heard him and interpreted what they said differently. So I will say that the more I researched, the less I knew. Here's what I used to think. 5 years ago, I thought Jack Ruby wanted to be the Jew that killed the guy that killed the president and then go down in a hail of bullets. I think he was doing I used to think he was doing public relations for the Jews. He'd be a hero, and he did get fan mail for quite a while, but he'd be a hero, and then he'd be shot because how could you not shoot that? How could you not shoot a guy who walked up and killed Lee Harvey Oswald? But because it was a room full of reporters and police and all sorts of other, civilians, nobody shot. Nobody, and because I think the police were gun shy after the assassination, nobody shot Jack Ruby.
All right, let's do the classic question. Was Jack Ruby good for the Jews?
So are we supposed to compare him to to Salk, say the Salk vaccine? Are we weighing Jack Ruby against the Salk vaccine?
Right.
I guess Jonas Salk. Of course not. But I will say, I'll say an interesting thing, because about 10 years ago, when I was still talking about it as a graphic novel and I was doing some presentations, somebody did say to me, do you really need to show this and talk about this? Cut to 10 years later, and I've had a great deal, I probably had the most interest in the book from Jewish people and institutions. So something, including and especially in Dallas, which was really, so it's very interesting that people are much more, Jewish people specifically, are much more interested in talking about and kind of accepting Jack Ruby as one of us, and something in Dallas, and of course anybody from Dallas will know what I'm talking about. I went into this room, with it's a crowded room, like 125 people, all around in the ballpark, most of them in the ballpark of my age. But these were people who were Jewish children and teenagers in Dallas on that weekend. So everybody had a story. Everybody knew somebody who, their father worked with Ruby, their uncle, so it was very personal. So no, but that question, is it good for the Jews? I wrote a book about the Jewish origin, the superheroes, and I sort of had to ask myself that question. And I just figure, if somebody's inclined to be prejudiced and anti-Semitic, they're gonna be. And I think bigotry and hatred they're not something that gets proved or proven. You come into something with an agenda and you interpret whatever information you see or that you get in that manner. So
Let me ask you this:
yeah.
Was Jack Ruby good for the mob?
You know, in the sense that I think he was actually exploited by the mob. You know, I think he was kind of mob affiliated and liked to make out like he was connected, and and I'm sure he was in some ways, but I think he was more, um, I think they made money off Jack Ruby, and maybe it helps to have people think that the mob could have been behind the Kennedy assassination.
Okay, let me, Amy. I want to ask one more. I'm going to ask Danny one more question. Then I'll turn it over to you for the chat questions. Danny, obviously we're talking about Jack Ruby today because he shot the man who shot Kennedy. What if he didn't shoot Jack Ruby? What if he was stopped?
That's very interesting. What if he didn't shoot Lee Harvey Oswald? You mean?
I'm sorry. What if Jack?
I've made that mistake myself. It's an easy mistake.
What if the sequence here? What if Jack Ruby hadn't shot Lee Harvey Oswald, or killed him, or any aspect of that? What if he was stopped first, or just never did it?
You know,
what would have happened to him?
It's funny. Nobody has asked me that question, and I've of course thought about it, but somehow seeing when you had sent me these questions to peruse the other day, that really jumped out at me. The first thought that came to my mind is he would have killed himself, that his life was in such bad shape and his mental state was such that I think he would, he'd had, bouts of depression. He was extreme in his moods. He did have a great self-preservation instinct, which maybe would have saved him, but I think ultimately he would have done himself in. Plus, I mean, he died 3 years later of like, 3 different life-threatening conditions, which maybe he was kind of what's the word, hypochondriac. So I mean, he might, doctor, that doctor's picture I showed, or one of his doctors might have caught the various, circulatory and cancer conditions, so I guess he could have kept going if he had not been killed by his various medical conditions. Maybe he could have kept going as kind of a colorful, weird character in the Dallas nightclub and Jewish, and he palled around with the police. A lot of people claim they were Jack Ruby's best friend. It's weird. He was a very unpleasant character, and a lot of people hated him. But as I've done my research, a lot of people would say, nobody really liked Jack Ruby except me, and I was his best friend. So he could have. But my first response to that is I think he would have killed himself.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, on that happy note, Amy, Amy, why don't you lead us in some of the questions from the audience, if you don't mind?
Sure. Well, thank you guys for that really, really thought-provoking presentation. And I think actually you've covered parts of almost all the questions that are in the chat, as people might have noticed if they were following along. We had several questions about conspiracies. I'll come back to the one that I think maybe wasn't covered, including somebody mentioned a Fabrengener, who probably known to a lot of people, David Chelmer, who wrote a book about the Kennedy assassination, going heavy on the conspiracy theories not too long ago. So just for friendly reasons. So of all the interesting things that are in the chat, I'll foreground just one little piece of wisdom, which you never know what people know that we didn't know. And Elaine Langer says that in a book called Gangsters versus Nazis, the fellow that was referenced as having the nickname Greasy Thumb came about because he not only was he Al Capone's right-hand man, but Greasy Thumb because he counted Capone's money.
There you go. Okay.
I think is a great little detail. Thank you to the Peanut Gallery there.
That's Michael Benson's book. I don't know if he's here. He did come to an event I did in New York last week, for which I thank him again. But that was, yes, Gangsters versus Nazis. Highly recommend.
Great, great. So out of all the conspiracy questions, I'm going to extract just one from Paul Kaplan, who, among several of versions of the $64,000 question, says, "What is your opinion, if any, about whether Ruby knew Oswald?" We won't. I mean, that seems like an actual question you can answer.
I'm guessing this is Paul Kaplan, my cousin, although
I don't know.
not
Paul
Paul,
Kaplan
but
doesn't say. The full question is, what is your
I know
opinion?
there's a theories. Look, there's theories that Ruby knew Oswald. There's theories that there were two Oswalds. Um, it's not impossible. Oswald worked a lot of menial, low-level jobs. But there are people who claim that Oswald was like Jack Ruby's gopher and would get his car. I've not seen, um, convincing proof of that, but Dallas was certainly a small. So I don't think that if they knew each other, I don't think they had a close relationship. I've certainly seen pictures where people say, here's a picture of Oswald sitting in the audience at Jack Ruby's Carousel Club, and the person in the picture looks nothing like Lee Harvey Oswald. So, I don't think they did, but given the small town that Dallas, as big as it is, had a small town aspect, it wouldn't shock me. But I don't think they worked together or had any kind of real relationship.
Okay. Okay. Mindy Reiser asks, why did the rabbi think it was important to spend time in jail with Ruby, and what were Ruby's relationships in general with the community, with the Jewish congregation?
I think the rabbi. I think the rabbi might have genuinely liked Ruby. But I think the rabbi was in some ways doing public relations for the Jews. I think he thought, boy, oh boy, this is really bad. Once he heard that the person who shot Oswald was Jewish, and a member of his congregation, he had been fairly friendly with Ruby. Not only had that business with him, giving Ruby giving them a puppy, um, but the rabbi had mediated an argument between Ruby and his sister. His sister had been very ill. I think she had a hysterectomy, and Jack was really her main lifeline. He'd bring her groceries. He'd visit her several times a day, but they were always squabbling. I mean, I think to the point of violence, actually. So they were related. They were pretty much husband and wife. Um, and they'd had a big falling out that I think probably involved Jack, being violent towards her, and the rabbi mediated, and so he was close to the family in that way. There were several other Ruby relatives living in town who I'm sure he knew. So I think he felt. I don't think he knew the first time he showed up that he was going to be going every other day, except, I think the rabbi was in his own way desirous of fame. He played himself in a TV movie called Oswald and Ruby. He did move to Hollywood. I used to wisecrack he went to Hollywood and became Buddy Hackett's rabbi, but it turns out he became Buddy Hackett's rabbi. So, so I think he liked the spotlight. I think he was concerned about Ruby. I think he was probably primarily trying to soften the idea that Ruby was Jewish. What I don't know, and maybe somebody out there does, I don't know the rabbi's attitude about capital punishment. So it might, if he was opposed to capital punishment, it might well have even been part of that. But look, I can only imagine once you get involved in that world and you're visiting Ruby and because he was also strategizing with the lawyers, strategizing with the family. He just got very involved in a very intimate way that somehow when I did interview him, and I've read many other interviews with him, and I've never seen that addressed. I don't remember if I asked him that directly, but I certainly seems like a question that I don't remember him ever addressing directly. Was there a second part to that question?
That was, well, there was a question about whether Ruby himself had any kind of, what kind of relationship did he have with the Jewish community or with his congregation?
I think he felt I think he was the weird guy. He was the weird guy in the congregation. I think he sort of had that role in the community.
Hmm.
Um, I think it's sort of embraced. Just like the Weinsteins were part of the community with their clubs and Honest Joe and the Zapruder family were I just think it was a big city but a small town within that. And I think Ruby was looked at as like kind of a pathetic, amusing, but possibly dangerous character. But he definitely, he had some role to play in that community, if only as like the schlemiel.
All right. Well, suddenly all these questions are pouring into the chat. If anyone, if people don't mind, we can go on. If people should feel free, obviously, to leave if they're done with Zoom. Please stay as long as if people will listen to more, that's great. So I will. So here's a quick one that follows on from your story about the rabbi and Ruby's family. What happened to? Wait, no, that's an Oswald question. That's not a good question. So since you said that about the rabbi getting what he wanted out of this whole situation, David Goldston wants to know, what was it about the Ruby trial that attracted all these really, really top flight lawyers? Like, what were they looking, like Kunstler, what were they looking to gain?
I think that's famous last words. I think that's actually an easy question. What could be a greater challenge for a lawyer than defending a guy who shot somebody on live television in front of millions of witnesses? Imagine, I think some of them were opposed to the death penalty and didn't want to see him go to the electric chair. So I think that was part of it, but some of it just would be, holy cow, what a challenge.
Right,
I think Kunstler even said that, that was part of, I think Kunstler originally had wanted to represent Oswald.
Ah.
But then,
Oh, wow.
I think as he was on his way to Dallas,
Danny, can I throw in I want that's actually interesting. In your book, it has struck me reading your book of how deflated some of these lawyers would have been or were when the great trial of Lee Harvey Oswald denied them. The attorney Wade was left. He would have been the guy to go after Oswald, and Melvin Belli or somebody or Kunstler flew back in the plane. I remember from the book, but it never occurred to me like these great careers would have been made by being in the Lee Harvey Oswald trial that was denied them. So is there like bitterness?
The career and also just the challenge,
Yeah.
They caught the next car on the train.
Huh?
So they caught the next car on the train,
Right.
Well, the weird thing is, and I think we still feel this today. And Ruby himself sent. Ruby got fan mail. People wrote to him saying, "You had the guts to do what nobody else could do. Thank you." I mean, just bags and bags of fan. But then at a certain point, the public consciousness started conflating him and Oswald.
Mm.
Maybe because of various conspiracy theories. Maybe if there's a conspiracy theory where Oswald and Ruby are part of the same plan, people started looking at him as if he was the one who killed Kennedy.
Interesting. So here's two questions that kind of can take up the Kennedy angle. I'll put them together. Is there evidence that Ruby was obsessed with Kennedy? And does anyone know where Ruby was when Kennedy was shot?
The general thing I have found, we don't know if Ruby even voted, but I would say he admired Kennedy because Kennedy was Catholic and therefore a member of a minority, and so he identified with Kennedy as a minority who would become president. So I would not say he was obsessed with him, except for that he sort of symbolized something for Ruby, and part two was Was he obsessed with Kennedy? And then there's I'd like the what was
The
the
other
second?
question was, does anyone know where he was when
Oh,
Kennedy was shot?
well, believe it or not, there's contradictory evidence.
Imagine that.
By most accounts, he was in the newspaper office, putting in his ads for the weekend entertainment at his clubs because his credit was so bad that they insisted he come in and pay in cash for placing his ads. That's how
Huh.
bad, that's how much in debt, and including to the IRS for $40,000 that he was, and $40,000 in 1963 money,
Hmm.
and to his family, and to, I'm sure, some less savory characters. So he was in there placing his ads when Kennedy was shot. There are those who put him, watching the parade. There are those who claim that he said to them, don't miss the parade. There's going to be some fireworks. But most people seem to think that he was, including people who were there who vouched for it, seem to think that he was in the newspaper office. There's question as to where he was after that. After Kennedy was shot, where Ruby was is controversial. So, but not, generally people think he was in the newspaper office placing his ads.
Mm-hmm. In
But,
either
but,
case,
but not outside watching, watching.
mhm. Would have been one of the first to know. I mean, if you want to play it that way.
Well,
Okay.
that is exactly,
Yeah. Yeah.
Danny, actually, let me ask you. I'm sorry, Amy. Danny, what's like the biggest thing you're just dying to know, like about this, that you just, despite all your exhaustive research, it's killing you. Why? Tell me, like, what else is out there for you?
I
That
mean,
you,
besides possible conspiracies
right?
or
Besides, right? Yeah, I guess besides that part of it, but
wow, that's what's the biggest thing that I want to know? Um, it's funny. I think I want to know more about the small things. I think I want to know, why did people keep coming back to him? Why did people get fired or quit, and then come back the next day, then get fired? What was it about this guy um, that had this weird, as repulsive as he was, and I think he was repulsive? What made people be loyal to him and keep coming back to him? I mean, obviously, I'd like to know all these I'd like to know, was there a conspiracy? I'd like to know why Ruby did, but Ruby himself gave, 10 different reasons why he did it. So I think what I'd like to know is more the little stuff. I'd like to understand. But one thing that did not happen to me in Dallas that I was afraid would, well, I think John Kennedy said that. But one thing that I was afraid that people would say to me, "Oh, you carpetbagger from New York, what do you know about Dallas? You totally don't understand." And for all your fancy book learning, you don't understand anything about Dallas, about being Jewish in Dallas, about owning a nightclub. So, so so although people were polite enough to not say that to my face, you know, if I had Robert Caro money and time, I probably would have, spent like a year in Dallas just getting to understand it fully.
Mhm. Well, on that note, I'll ask two more questions that are really very, very specific things. And since you mentioned Caro, I'm going to take up this question that came in at the very bottom of the chat. Any connections between Ruby and LBJ?
Ruby, like Ruby directly and LBJ? No, no.
I wouldn't think so, but
Um,
it's a good question though.
yeah, I mean that. I'm trying to think if there's any, kind of trivia question or any. No, I think the only. Okay, well, here's at a certain point, Ruby did become obsessed with Abe Fortas.
Ah,
Was a Jewish guy that LBJ had nominated for the Supreme Court, and he had, I forget, some kind of scandal or something
he
in
was
his.
on he was on the court, and then
Oh, was he on the court? But then he resigned.
he was forced to resign because of a scandal that
That's
we
it.
now yeah that under
So
under
that
he was
so
forced to.
at certain point, Ruby did become obsessed with Ruby became obsessed with getting to talk to Johnson, even though at other times he
Hmm.
accused Johnson of being behind the assassination. But as
Okay.
part of Ruby's Johnson obsession, so Fortas played a big Fortas, and I think Joe Valachi also. I think
Hmm.
who had that Joe Valachi was a mobster who testified briefly, testified shortly before the assassination. Joe Valachi was the first mobster to really give detailed testimony on how the mob worked, and even the name Cosa Nostra, and that was televised. And I think in some weird way, Ruby kind of was emulating or wanted to emulate Joe Valachi. But anyway, that's far afield, you know.
That's interesting. All right, I'll ask one last question and then we'll wrap it up at 8:30. Daniel Feldman says, a book I read about tough Jews states that Jack Sparky Rubenstein, I guess the same guy, was
Yeah.
among a group of tough Jewish street guys in Chicago, loosely aligned with the Chicago mob, who broke up German Bund pro-Nazi demonstrations with clubs and their fists. Do you know anything about that?
Yes, although of course Michael Benson knows much more because he wrote a book called Gangsters versus Nazis. Yes,
Okay.
Jack Ruby was famous for being, finding out where Bund meetings were, and going and busting them up and breaking heads, and along with his pal Barney Ross sometimes. But yeah, that was sort of in the check mark of positives in Jack Ruby's resume.
Mhm.
Um, that that yes, he seemed to be very good at that, and people admired it. And he also later went on to, again, he became a organizer for a Chicago union, and most probably in Jack Ruby's case that meant a leg breaker for a union. So he was a blunt instrument used by many different people.
Interesting. Okay. Well, on that elevated note, I'm going to throw it back to Howard and thank you again for this sort of
Oh, thank you.
endless
Thanks so much.
topic.
Danny, I have two final quick questions. First, the TV series Dallas, J.R. Ewing. Any chance J.R. initials for Jack Ruby?
Oh God.
J.R. Ewing.
No, it would not surprise me, but I have not investigated that rabbit hole.
All right. Okay. And the final question, and before the final question, thanks to everybody who joined us tonight I love this conversation. And again, thanks to Danny for writing the book and the Jewish Studies Center. Please participate, give, be part of this. What Amy and Jerry are doing as volunteers is just absolutely extraordinary. So thank you to you both. Danny, final question for me. You've written now about Jack Ruby and Stan Lee. Any takeaways from the two of them? Any similarities? Anything we should?
It's funny. Somebody pointed out to me that those photos above your head, kind of look like 1950s era Stan Lee, but a little chubbier than he was. I didn't see it at first, but I could maybe see that. No, I mean, I think although there are people who have accused Stan Lee of various, infractions and offenses, no, nothing to level my wisecrack on that, because actually it was very, very early, several months ago. Somebody wanted me to give a talk about both books, which was weird. So my smart ass wisecrack is, 1963 was also the year that the Avengers and the X-Men first came out. So I say that Jack Ruby and Stan Lee both had big years in 1963. But on a less snarky note, Jack Kirby, who with Stan Lee co-created all, the Fantastic Four, the Avengers, Iron Man, Thor, X-Men, drew a Jack Ruby story for Esquire. I think they knew about Kirby because Marvel was becoming famous, and also they've been writing. They'd had a bunch of stories about Marvel, and so Kirby drew a 3-pager, but really tiny, a lot of pounds, so maybe more like a fair, short story based on the Warren Commission about Jack Ruby for the issue of Esquire that came out just after Ruby died. You can find it online. It was edited by a guy named John Berendt, who wrote Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil. And I was in touch with him, and he gave me, he didn't remember who had written it, although he had edited it. So I never did find out exactly who wrote it, but there is kind of a, if you look long enough, there are comics connections to everything, including to Jack Ruby.
So we probably shouldn't end by saying "Hail Hydra," is what you're saying. We should leave.
I prefer Excelsior to.
Let me get in the last word. Before I get the last word, I really have a question. I mean, I read the book, but I forgot the answer. The biggest thing really about the whole Ruby business is, how did William Kunstler get him off? I mean, everybody saw him kill Oswald.
You didn't get him off, did you?
And
well, he got the. Well, it's very. I mean, by the way, I'll answer that. But first, I want to thank Jerry and Howard and Amy and the Jewish Study Center, and especially Ron Zoni, who was a pen for a friend of mine, who was the guy who first connected me with the Jewish Study Center. Because, as you may recall, a couple of years ago, I participated in the Hamantash and Latka debate that Howard so masterfully moderated. But I want to thank all of you and everybody who came, especially those of you not actually related to me. So thank you. So Jerry, how did Kunstler get? Well, this is sort of retroactively justifies Melvin Belli. What comes, the judge, who was made fun of, by the way, by certain people for reading comic books on the bench. What an idiot, huh? So the judge, there were a dozen different reasons that trial should not have taken place, that the judge should not have been the judge, and Dallas should not have been the venue. And they were everybody was so eager to prosecute Ruby, and really by proxy to prosecute Oswald. So, and Belli was easy to make fun of. Belli was very full of himself and fancy dressed, and came from San Francisco, and with his fancy ideas of something he called psychomotor epilepsy. That was his very esoteric psychological defense, and it didn't work. And part of the reason it didn't work was the guidelines the jury was given were so narrow that there was no room for any consideration of Ruby's state of mind or previous trauma to his head or brain. So essentially what Kunstler did was took it to a higher court in Texas, and he pretty much used the same arguments that Belli had used, but this court, they didn't exonerate Ruby, but they overturned the verdict, and then before he could be retried, he died. So that was how that worked.
Okay, you kill someone in front of millions of people, you expect to get
right.
At least in prison.
Well, and also, Texas, and again, Texans here can correct me if I'm wrong, had a tradition of people of crimes of passion where people would literally go free, and there was some. So that was one school of thought. I don't think that would have worked, but anyway, but that is how somebody who did what he did in front of millions of people could still at least not get the death penalty, if nothing else.
Well, let me end this thing, but as Amy and Howard said, I thank everyone, Howard and Danny and stuff, and Amy for a very entertaining and informative evening. We do have more classes coming up. Right now on our website, there's no classes scheduled, but we actually do have classes scheduled. They're not really in the website. In 2 weeks from now, we're going to have a talk by somebody about the Leslie Weiss, about the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, and in this day of anti-Semitism, and people say, "Oh, I'm not anti-Semitic," you are, whatever. The definition that this group has made, which is many nations have officially accepted and other people haven't, is very controversial. She won't be talking about that only, but that's one aspect of that, the IHRA definition. And then the week after that, on the 21st of February, we're going to have a talk about writing Torah scrolls. You know, who writes Torah scrolls? How do you do it? Who's allowed to, etc. And then 2 weeks after that, and the first week in March, we're going to have a talk about small town Jewish communities. I come from the Catskills, and in some sense, we're a small town. And I've also lived in towns which weren't small, but the community is small. And the Jewish communities are quite different when you're in a small Jewish community rather than like Washington, D.C. or New York City. So we'll talk about that also. So you will all get an email from us about all these things. Keep tuned, basically. And thank you again for a great evening.
Thank you.